Welcome back. So we are starting the last lecture of Unit 3. This lecture is on representation. Technically, this is our art impulse lecture for Unit 3. And representation is, I think, one of our art impulses in part because representation is kind of a fundamental desire that many people have of artwork, the desire to, see the visual world that we see, like the plants, the flowers, the animals, the people, and to represent those things, to be able to represent those things, to represent the spaces that we know. That, I think, is a pretty fundamental purpose, a fundamental desire that people have for artwork, what something they want to achieve in artwork. And I think it's also relevant to the Art Impulse lectures as a whole, because many of the other art impulses are kind of dependent on the idea of representation. What I mean by that is that, let's say, the narrative impulse that we just discussed, it's pretty much impossible to have narrative incorporated into a work of art if you're not also going to have some representation. But I think this lecture is about that aspect of representation, but it's more. I mean, we could have a, just a lecture where I simply just show you examples of different ways people have represented different things. But I think that the very concept of representation is complex and rather problematic in that people tend to think they know exactly what they mean by representation and what they mean by realistic or what they mean by real. And in fact, oftentimes their conception of these things is incomplete or misskewed. So this lecture is going to be as much about representation as an art impulse. More, it's going to be about just breaking down the very concept of representation and getting us to really think deeply about what representation means. So we're going to start by first kind of talking about the fact that a lot of the artwork that we've looked at from the very beginning of the class has been representational, but many of it has also looked very odd, had been kind of oddly stylized, oddly idealized. I think if you think of the Venus of Willendorf would probably be a perfect example of that. Whereas some others seem much more real, much more naturalistic. But my point here is that all of these, whether we're looking at the Cycladic sculpture, even if I had the Venus of Willendorf on here, or this seated figure of Judea, or the Egyptian figures, they are all equally stylized and equally unreal and idealized. Right? We look at this figure, and he seems very close to real. Doryphoros seems very close to our sense of, photographic representation. But if you really examine him and look at the way his body has been figured out in terms of basic geometric forms, you'll notice that he is actually much more stylized, much more elegant than just a simple direct representation. I think a perfect example of that is this convention that they've used with the stylization of the iliac crest right here into the bottom of the abdomen, and the way that becomes one whole complete line. And that's a perfect example of kind of a geometric stylization of the human form. But really all of this, like the way they're thinking about the plane of the bottom of the jaw, or the stylization, or the stylization of the eyes. So, what does it mean that something is idealized? Well, this is kind of an important topic for the Greeks. The Greeks were very much interested in the ideal, and it was a very important concept to them religiously and philosophically as well as aesthetically. It's really important for us to understand that the Greeks did not make sculptures like this or like Polykleitos' Doryphoros. They did not make them as portraits. They hired models, but the one thing they never did was have a model stand and make a sculpture that's an exact representation of that particular model. That was not a concept that was interesting to them. Instead, with every work of sculpture that they made, they were trying to produce an ideal. They may have looked at real live human beings but they use them as models to help them get to something more real, right? At least more ideal. So where does this concept come from? Well, it comes from a lot of different parts of Greek culture, but let's just examine the philosophical sort of roots. In the Plato wrote a piece called a parable called the parable of the cave, and in it he talked about this idea that if a person lived in a cave his entire life, and some other people lived in the cave as well, and so they were chained into the cave, and their entire life they saw the outside world, but only they saw it through the cast shadows onto the wall in the cave, so that when people walked by, they saw the shadows of people. When horses walked by, they saw the shadows of horses. When carts went by, so you get the idea. So that their understanding of reality was just the projections, just the shadows on the wall. And then one day, this person escapes from the cave and he gets out and he's out in the real world and he realizes that's not a horse. That cast shadow thing that I saw, that's not a horse. That's a horse when he sees the real live thing, right? Does that make sense? And so then he goes back to the cave and he goes and he tells everyone, the life you're living is just an illusion. It's not the full thing. These are just phantasms, just reflections on the surface of the wall of the cave. So what did this story mean? Well, this basically was getting at this idea that in Greek philosophy, they believed in the realness of the ideal of a thing, right? Like the way a Greek philosopher would explain it would be, if you looked at a chair, any chair, every chair you look at would be imperfect, right? Because of course they didn't live in a world where things were mass produced, where things were really, like high industrial, high quality chairs were made. Every chair was handmade. So every chair you look at, you could find flaws to it, was imperfect in some way. But looking at chairs, if you saw 3 or 4 chairs, you could quickly, easily imagine what a perfect chair would look like, right? And so the Greek philosophers believed that the concept of the chair, the concept of the perfect chair, was the more real thing, because that was the ideal that was true and perfect, and that all of the physical chairs in our world are just shadows, just mere reflections of that ideal. So if you start with that concept, right, of that kind of philosophical concept, and that was also a part of Greek religion and part of Greek aesthetics, you could then kind of understand why pursuing idealism in their sculpture was way more important than pursuing realism, right? They were interested in naturalism, meaning the study of nature, the study of a model of human form, but only as a goal towards getting to the ideal. So, next question. What is representation, right? What do we mean when we say something is a good representation? And so here's 2 examples of what I would say are fantastic, great representations. But they are representations by what standard, right? They're not naturalistic by any means, right? One is the Buffalo Bills logo, right? It's not accurate. I mean, like, look at that leg right there, or that weird line that cuts into that leg. They're not accurate to the way an actual American buffalo looks or stands, or the physical quality. We can't really see the hair. We can't see the color of the animal, right? We can't see anything about it. And if you look at the Scythian decoration, right, piece right here, a representation of a stag, it's in many ways stylized and unrealistic. But, hold on a second, that's my 1-minute warning. But both of these are extremely wonderful representations in the fact that they pick one aspect of a thing and they highlight that. So for the Buffalo Bills logo, it's not so much a representation of a buffalo, it's a representation of force, of energy, of mass and energy in motion, right? The Scythian piece of the stag, representation of the stag, is not so much about what actual stags look like in the woods. It's about the movement, the speed, and about the size and the beauty of those antlers, right? And repeating them as a pattern. So, okay, that's where we're going to end for part 1. Hopefully we can finish this in just 2 parts.